everybody. This is Joanna Schaffner-Scott, and you are listening to the Race in the Workplace podcast, a show for DEI organizational leaders that explores race, racism, and racial equity in the workplace. I am a racial equity consultant and founder of the Stamey Street Consulting Group, a consulting firm that specializes in partnering with organizations to help them meet their racial equity aspirations. My goal for you is to move your organization from being colorblind to equity-centered through sustainable, step-by-step changes. Hi, it's Joanna Schaffner-Scott here. I am so excited to be with you today. Thank you for allowing me to join you in your day, no matter when you're listening. I am looking forward to the conversation today, y'all. I'm talking about creative, inclusive work cultures with my colleague, Dr. Michael Baran, CEO and founder of Iris Inclusion. Michael and I partnered on a couple of projects earlier in the pandemic. I like his approach and his style, particularly around reframing microaggressions as subtle acts of exclusion. We'll get into that later, but Michael also has a great book co-authored with Dr. Tiffany Jana called Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. And as I said, we'll get into that later. So I wanted to invite him on the podcast to talk about his work, his approach to working with organizations to create more inclusive workspaces. And one of the themes that I want you all to hear as Michael is sharing is that creating inclusion is not organic. It takes intentionality. So I'm looking forward to that conversation with Michael. So a little bit more about Michael. Michael's work draws on his own research in cultural anthropology and cognitive psychology to inform his current diversity, equity, and inclusion work. His speaking engagements, writings, consulting, leadership development, and workshop facilitation, as well as digital products. He's been supporting the DEI efforts of organizations of all types and sizes for 20 years, y'all. So he's bringing a lot of experience today, and I'm excited to tap into it. And his work has included Fortune 500 corporations to educational institutions, government agencies, and nonprofits. So Michael has a lot to offer today. So lean in and listen and let us get into it. So hi, Michael. Welcome to the podcast.
So excited to be here with you.
I did a little bit of work on your bio, but would love for you to introduce yourself to the audience. So tell us who you are, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Michael Baran. I'm the CEO and founder of Iris Inclusion. My pronouns are he, him. If you're not seeing a picture of me, I'm a cisgender white man. And Iris Inclusion is a relatively new global diversity, equity, and inclusion firm that I started around 8 or 9 months ago, which is named after the Iris Flower Farm that I live on in Maryland. I know You're a Marylander as well. And so I can tell you all about the work we're doing as well. You know, the firm's relatively new, but as you mentioned, I've been doing this work for a long time. And so I'm really excited now to be doing it in a way that I feel like I've kind of been building up to for a long time, right? So supporting organizations in all of their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, no matter where they're starting from on their journey. And certainly the bulk of what I'm doing right now is speaking oftentimes about the book that you mentioned, but not only, designing and delivering trainings of different kinds, building new e-learning and self-paced diversity, equity, and inclusion training tools when folks can't do in-person or either remote or live in a room trainings, and consulting on strategy and communications and things like that. And then, of course, doing all those other things that it takes to run your own business that I hadn't thought about before, like how do I do taxes? All that good stuff.
One of the things that I so much appreciate your style, I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but one of the things I appreciate is I think of you as being firm in your approach, but gentle. In the client work that we've done together, that's how I experience you. Is I think you see kind of where people need to go and are gentle and guiding them there.
Oh, that means a lot. I appreciate that. That is... You have nailed the style that I've been trying to cultivate.
The secret's out.
Yes. I mean, it's that combination. And I think that's part of the researcher in me, right? I am very evidence-based. I see things as they are. I want people to understand that. I don't want to mince words about that. But but I want to do it in a way that calls them in, that brings them along the journey with me.
I appreciate that so much. And since you talked about journeys, I find that all of us who do this work often have a jagged journey, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we often started out doing something else, landed in this space. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your journey. Like, how did you land in this space from being a cultural
Mm-hmm.
anthropologist to
Mm-hmm.
now doing DEI work and
Yeah.
owning your own firm? What's that journey been like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think of where I started. Like, I could start it with like 5-year-old me. Um, Maybe I'll start with, you know, I won't go into childhood, but I will say I did land in graduate school because of a couple things, because of developing along the way as a child and as a young adult a real passion, a passion for justice, a passion for equity and inclusion, even if I wasn't using those words at that time, along with a real like researcher's mind, like an intellectual curiosity. Things like, wait a minute, why are people acting like they are? Okay, people are talking about unconscious bias. Like, why do we have these biases in our heads that we don't know are there and we wouldn't even want to be there? Like, how does that happen? How is
Mm-hmm.
it that cultures are making some people feel great and included and other people not so much, but the ways that it happens is subtle? Like, how are societies structured that are perpetuating this inequity? And so went to graduate school to really try to dive into some of those questions. So got my doctorate in cultural anthropology, like you said, and cognitive psychology at the University of Michigan. They have this great program called the Culture and Cognition Program, which is combining these two things, which I think it's bizarre that they aren't often combined because they seem to go together. And so spent 8 years diving into questions like that, doing my own research. I lived in Northeast Brazil actually for 2 years, looking at some of those questions. The idea being, this is what cultural anthropologists often do. They often go to live in a place that is very unfamiliar. It's not your home culture. And so you can't take anything for granted. You can't make assumptions about anything that you're seeing.
Wow.
All you can do is really observe what's going on, really ask questions, really listen to the responses, because you've got to figure that out. And then, of course, you learn some things that are more generally applicable to the way culture and cognition work in other places. And of course, you come home to your own culture, and that's where the real culture shock happens. Because all of a sudden, things that used to feel so natural, all of a sudden you feel like you've got an objective perspective and you can see things happening that seem strange, and you can have a perspective on that. So throughout that process, just got more and more fascinated and passionate about really doing something about it. So after graduate school, when you go to a place like University of Michigan, the expectation is sort of like, well, you're going to go into a teaching career. You're going to
Yes.
teach at a university. And I did teach for a few years. I taught at Harvard for maybe 3 or 4 years. But while I was there, I always knew I wanted to apply what I had learned and what I was figuring out. So I started actually my first DEI consultancy on the side. And I was doing a little work through that, but mostly teaching. Then I ended up being a researcher in various nonprofits, the Frameworks Institute and American Institutes for Research, where I would do cultural research to better inform communications campaigns. Things like, how can we reduce violence against children in Haiti? Or like, how can we create more inclusion for people when they come in for HIV testing, or things like that. And all the while, my consultancy kind of was snowballing and growing.
Yeah.
I still kept
Mm-hmm.
it going on the side. And then it finally hit a point where I just thought, this is where most of my energy and passion is going. It's time to do this full time. And at that time, that was a while ago that I did that. I was thinking, do I start my own company and find a team? I just so happened to meet people who I really clicked with and joined a group, a DEI firm called Inquest
Mm-hmm.
Consulting, and worked as part of that group for a long time. And they're great. And it was such a great collaborative effort. And then as my thinking evolved, as what I wanted to do evolved, it just came to the point around 8 months ago that I thought, okay, now is the time where I'm gonna do this in the way that I'm really wanting to do. I really see
Wow.
my work evolving. And so that's been amazing because now I get to think in a fresh new way. Who are the people I want to bring in on my team? Who are the people I want to collaborate with? What do I want to spend my time doing? What do I want to spend our company's resources in and investing in? And so it's just been fantastic.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like my journey. I think we've talked about this, where I worked and collaborated with the Race Matters Institute for years and
Right.
years,
Yep.
and then just had questions about how organizations really function. And I just had some evolving in my thinking, and then it was sort of like, I feel like I need a new space. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
well, of course, you know what I mean. And so I think it's so interesting as you were talking that how your journey was sort of knit together by all of these questions, like these
Mm-hmm.
sort of questions that may have started off in your heart and then became these other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that, that's that core that you're talking about that really does form the core of how we're approaching the work at Iris
Yes.
Conclusion, which is it's evidence based. It's built on like deep understanding, really understanding when we understand why these things are happening, whether it's in a society, a culture, an organization, a team, when we understand why things are happening, that gives us the map for thinking about what do we do about it. And people get more invested when you can explain to them why things are happening the way they're happening. Then the solutions make sense. Then it's not somebody in a patronizing way telling them, do this, don't do this. And they're like, well, why? Well, right. But when you really understand how it all works, you get way more invested in the solutions. They make sense. You can get inspired and invested to really change behaviors, which, as you know, is not an easy thing. Changing behaviors is not easy. And so we need to use all those resources to get people there.
I appreciate that so much because I think, to your point, when people understand the why, so
Mm-hmm.
if we're talking about equity, racial equity, or other forms of equity, when people understand why that's important, that is such a powerful starting place. And that why has to hold a lot because it has to hold people's questions and
Mm-hmm.
people's pushback around that.
Yes. Ooh, yes.
I know. I know. So I want to ask you, so I'm so curious, given the background that you have and sort of this inherent curiosity that I'm hearing, how do you draw that into your client work? How does that inform the way that you work with clients who want to be intentional about their workplace?
I mean, in some ways, such a great question. It's taken me, right, years and decades to kind of build the complete narrative in my head about why things are happening and how they go together and fit together, sometimes in unexpected ways, and what's at stake here. Why does this really matter? And what can we do about it? And so, in a very condensed way, as much time as I can get with people, whether that's people who have devoted days to intensive workshops, or whether it's people who are only able to dedicate an hour to a self paced e learning module. How
Yes.
can I bring people along on that journey that I've already gone through so that they can get some of this narrative themselves? So they get it in the way that I do. And so that's where a lot of, and you've mentioned this and we've talked before, that's some of the pedagogical approach that comes when you are a teacher, when you really try to
Mhm.
put yourself in the shoes of a learner and get them to understand things in the way that you do. And so that's sometimes the approach that I take. It's very much, I want to help build that deep understanding for you. And I want to do it with research, but not research in a boring, dry, unframed way, right? I want to tell stories about research. I want to tell personal stories. I want to be vulnerable myself. I want to let other people's words stand on their own. So one of the things I've done, I'm talking about subtle acts of exclusion, for example. I went out on the street with a videographer and I interviewed anyone who was willing and asked people questions like, what are some of the subtle things that happen to you at work that make you feel bad and other people might not realize it? and they have these amazing responses. And then I use some of those video clips because I went out with a videographer in my trainings. And that's just like light bulbs for people, to give you an
Mm-hmm.
example. I mean, these clips because you've worked with me on sessions. But, if you have a man who's blind talking about walking down the hall and people silently flattening themselves up against the wall to get out of his way. And he says, look, I know you're trying to, not only are you not trying to hurt me, you're trying to help me by getting out of my way, but it makes me feel bad. Like it makes me
Yeah.
feel like a burden, and it makes me feel like not a full human. And if you just said, hey, Bob, it's me, Michael, walking on your left, I could feel like a person. I might have a question I need to ask you if I know it's you, and it would help me get down the hall better. And seeing the emotion on people's faces, like real people, not stock smiling photos of people, like real people, it's just light bulbs for people, or like
Yes.
there's another video clip that's so illuminating for people. A Black woman explaining, people are saying, I'm so professional. People tell me all the time, oh, you're so professional. Like, as opposed to what? Like, why do you keep saying that to me? Right.
Yeah.
And this is so interesting because I've had people literally stop me on the street after talks and like try to dig in more. Like, can I really not call someone professional if they're professional? Like, it just sparks the curiosity in them because it's a real thing. It's a real person. You can see it matters to them from the emotion on their face. And so it sparks their curiosity.
And I remember seeing those videos and being struck because people were sharing from different perspectives or different identities.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being struck watching those.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed as you were describing that, you didn't use the word microaggressions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I would call those actions.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So why subtle acts of exclusion and not microaggressions?
Yeah. So the word microaggressions, right? It's been around since the early 1970s based on the work of Chester Pierce. So glad that it came into lexicon and consciousness because he was calling attention to these things that were flying under the radar that were not getting noticed as discriminations. And so, yay, right? And here we are 50 years later, and the research is showing us that these things are still happening all the time, right? Especially to people of marginalized identities. And so we would go in to do microaggressions workshops, right? We get called in to do them. And they were so unbelievably frustrating for a couple different reasons, right? So first, we'd give a very common example of a microaggression. I think probably the most iconic example is calling a Black person articulate or well-spoken. It's, there are hundreds of articles written about this when Obama was a candidate. This is very well known. So we'd give a well-known example like that, and you'd be encountered with like a wall of defensiveness. People would say, you can't call that a microaggression if I was just trying to give you a compliment. Like, you are well spoken, right? I just meant to give you a compliment. And so the word microaggression was almost focusing our attention on someone's intention rather than the impact, right? So we'd get a lot of that. If you don't know the intention, you can't even call it a microaggression. Also, what's the other part of that word? Micro. What does micro mean to most people, right? Small, unimportant. So if they're happening to you, well, that doesn't quite feel like it captures your experience because they don't feel small at all. And in fact, they're not small. They have huge negative effects for people, right? Including like mental and physical health issues when people experience these microaggressions consistently. So they're not small at all. And what subtle message does that give to everyone else who came to this workshop? Hey, we're going to talk about something small and unimportant. How invested are you to really change your behaviors, to really pay attention rather than like, doing something else on your computer? And so for a while, it felt to me like the word microaggression was getting in the way of the work that we could do. I knew we could do the work of people being able to share their experiences, other people hearing them, building some trust, building some connection. I know we could do the work. Why is that word getting in our way sometimes? And so I would kind of mutter under my breath, like, somebody's got to think of a new word for this thing. And happened to be talking to friend and fellow DEI practitioner, Dr. Tiffany Jana. Tiffany was like, oh my gosh, I'm finding the same thing. Tiffany is maybe a little more bold and audacious than I was, and was like, what if we could think of a new word for it? What if we could reconceptualize this and write a book about it? And so that's what kind of sparked that idea. And then, of course, it's kind of fun to think about reframing a concept. We had a long list of potential reframes.
Mm-hmm.
Some we were trying to be clever, and some we were trying to be jargony, and some we were trying to be sticky. And in the end, we just thought, you know what? The best thing is probably just call them what they are in a straightforward way. Like, they're subtle. It doesn't mean they feel subtle. They might feel like a slap in the face, but it's the subtlety which allows people to deny that they even happen. It's the subtlety which allows them to fly under the radar and keep happening. They're acts, they're things people say and do. They're not intentions necessarily. And we thought, let's name the problem right in the term itself. The problem is they're creating the opposite of inclusion, right? If inclusion is feeling welcomed, valued, respected, heard, understood, supported, these are creating the opposite of that. And so let's put that right in the term itself. So that's what led to that. It's not like we're saying, oh, never use the word microaggressions, right? This is just hopefully giving people a new way to approach this, to understand this, to make some progress finally on something which has been stuck for so long. And luckily, it is helping people make some progress, whether that's people who have been able to have a new language and a new framework for talking about what they've experienced, or people who can understand a little bit better what they might have been saying and inadvertently causing harm, or people who wanted to do better and wanted to practice allyship but don't really know how and don't really have the language for doing it. So that's a long answer to your question.
But I appreciate it. I remember, so when we first started working together, so I went and got the book. And as you know, I'm a fan, and I send clients your way who struggle with this in their organizations, because I think the way you do it, again, is firm and gentle. And I remember thinking, is this another way to hide white supremacy? Like, is this a way to give it out to that? So I want to just ask you that question, and then I want to share an experience I had with a client with this book.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, certainly that is not the intent, right? And like you said, it's trying to be firm but gentle. Call these what they are, to create kind of a combination of kindness, transparency, and accountability. To
I love that.
absolutely call out words and actions that are creating exclusion, but in a way that is calling people in, right? I mean, we all know it might feel great or funny or clever to call people out in different ways, like on Twitter or something. But if you work with these people, or they're in your family or your friend group, it's probably not your best strategy if your goal is actually being understood and creating more understanding and more trust. We need different tools to be able to do that. So that's the idea. A tool to be absolutely clear and straightforward about what the experience is, and to help people be able to take that feedback and do better, like really do better.
Yes. So I shared that question for folks who are listening. If you're multitasking, come back to us, because this is an important part of the conversation. I struggled with that, with the reframe, and I shared this with you, until I had an experience in some work where I encountered a person who could not wrap their mind around microaggressions. Like, no matter how many examples, videos, people sharing personal experiences, it just couldn't crack the shell around that word, because that word itself was so off-putting that the person couldn't wrap their mind around. And so then when I'm seeing this play out, I'm like, oh, they need another on-ramp, right? To be able to process the behavior. Because if you can't even process the word, we never get to the behavior. And I think that's what you were saying, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The word for some people, like you're saying, it just is a non-starter. And yet, with another on-ramp, they can actually get there. That's the deal. It's not like they're lost forever. Like, they can get there.
Yes, yes. And one thing I wanted to ask, this is my favorite part of that piece of work that you do, and that is your work gives people a bit of a framework for how to handle these acts when they occur. I
Mhm,
love that because I think so
mhm,
many books and articles sort of describe
mhm.
but don't give folks like a little bit of a map for action,
Right.
right? And I've seen you do this like in
Yep.
session. So I've seen the power of it.
Yeah.
And I love that. So
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit about how you've seen people use that sort of, express gratitude when
Mhm.
someone's calling you into a conversation, resist defensiveness, like those steps that you give people?
Yeah, I love that too. That was really important to Tiffany and I right from the get go is that this gives you something you can put in action literally like the minute you finish reading the book or attending a training or a talk or whatever it is. And it's for everyone, right? Whether you're
Yes.
the person who has experienced subtle acts of exclusion or you recognize yourself as someone who has said them. And by the way, that's all of us. Like every
Yes.
single one of us has said
Yes.
things that has made someone feel excluded and we didn't mean to, but we did it.
Mhm.
Some more
Mhm.
than others, but
Some people are sitting in that framework a long time.
yes.
So to speak, very quickly.
Uh-huh. Or you're a person who does maybe recognize it and wants to step in and practice some allyship, but doesn't really know how and doesn't want to feel like
Yeah.
you're stepping on toes. And so those guidelines are important no matter which one of those roles you're playing in any given moment, because all three usually exist, right? And so what we've seen people be able to do is, yeah, just have conversations that they've been wanting to have, sometimes maybe for years, literally years. Something happened. I didn't know how to talk about it. It's been weighing on me. And now I have a framework where I can focus on impact, how it
Mhm.
impacted me, or maybe how it impacted other people, and the other person could actually take that feedback. That's one of the biggest pieces of it is
Mhm.
if you're the person getting the feedback, how do you not just say, no, 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 I didn't mean it like that. No, no,
Yes,
no,
I'm not
that's
that
not what I was.
person. Yep. Mhm.
Like, that's one of the biggest pieces to allow that person to relax into the fact that that feedback is a gift. It
Yes.
really is. Here you are trying to be your best person, trying hard to be your most inclusive, right? And it sucks when you're trying so hard and then you feel like you're getting accused of being a bad person. That's where the defensiveness comes in, right?
Mhm.
I'm trying so
Mhm.
hard and I'm getting accused of being a bad person. But that's not what you're being accused of. Someone's just saying, hey, I know you didn't mean it, but those words or that action made me feel like this. And you can take that feedback as a gift. Oh, that's a way I could be more inclusive with that person. Like
Yes.
someone handed that to me on a silver platter. That's helpful to me, right?
Mhm.
And you and our relationship and our team and our organization, right? And so
Yes.
being able to take that is just great. So I love coming back. The first sessions I did with people using this new framework are now like have happened 2 or 3 years ago, the first ones as the book first came out. And so coming back and doing continued work with those organizations and hearing the stories of how they've been able to have these conversations in a whole new way because of that framework and those guidelines,
Yes.
and how
Yes.
they've also been able to have a whole bunch of other hard conversations because they've used the same guidelines. That makes it feel so amazing and worthwhile and exciting that organizations in some small and some big ways have been able to actually make progress on this.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much because to your point, I mean, I've caught myself doing the same thing, like, misgendering a person, for
Hmm.
example, and then kind of launching into, I'm not a person who does that.
Right.
And in that moment, I absolutely was.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
then the question becomes, how do you handle that and how do you learn from it and apologize
Yeah.
and move on holding the relationship, right?
Yep.
So I just think it's really powerful and I wanted my listeners to hear that. And I'll link to the book in the show notes, of course. But I think it's powerful because I think it gives people something they can do. It's not easy
Right.
for
Mm-mm.
either the person who started it or the person who's the subject of it. And I think that's the part organizations may struggle with. Like, you have to kind of have an agreement that we're going to call each other in, but it can be so powerful to step into that brave place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You're right. It is not easy. Even sometimes you can do all the things right and it still doesn't go great. But there's something really helpful to getting people to realize that we're all going to mess up. If we're trying to connect with people who are different from us, we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to mess up. You can't change the fact that you said something. Like sometimes you say it and you see the look on someone's face and you know, oh, that might
Mm-hmm.
not have been a great thing to say. That might
Mm-hmm.
not have been a great thing to do. And you just hope that you wish you never said it and you hope nobody noticed, but of course they
Yeah.
did. And like,
Now somebody dropped it in the Slack channel, so you
yeah,
gotta you gotta address it.
right, right. So you can't change the fact that you did it or said it. The only thing you can change is how you respond and how you
Yes.
engage afterwards. And getting people to realize those moments. And when we think about inclusion or psychological safety, those moments matter so much.
Yes.
Like, if you don't respond well, you build a wall or distance that will likely always be there between you and that person. And if you do respond well, even when you said something that you messed up, like even out of making someone feel bad, you can actually build a closer relationship.
It's so powerful. And I think it's so critical to creating inclusive culture is making these kind of agreements and having the space to mess up,
Yeah.
being brave enough to own it
Hmm.
and commit to doing better.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit, pivot just a little bit, and talk about some of the work that you're doing on psychological safety that you just mentioned. I would love to hear more about it. I'm hearing more about it like in discourse,
Yeah.
seeing more organizations who need to be intentional about creating it.
Hmm.
And so talk a little bit about your work in that space. What does that look like?
It is so important, right? People are not going to feel inclusion if they don't feel psychological safety. Safety to be themselves, first of all, and safety to make mistakes and all of that.
Yes.
And it also just so happens that it's really important for how we work together, right? I think in the latest Google research, the number one factor in teams performing at their highest levels is their psychological safety. Do people feel
Wow. Mm-hmm.
psychological safety? So it matters. And we know that people do not feel it to the same degree. I mean, just look at the stats on LGBTQIA plus folks who are just open about that part of their identity at work. In the US, on average, is almost 50% of people
Wow.
who are not open about that at work because they don't feel the psychological safety. And does it take not feeling safe for the majority of people to not feel the safety, or just one or two, right? If
Oh,
you
good
don't
question.
feel the safety with one or two people, that makes it so you don't feel safety in the whole place.
Wow.
So the work is getting a lot of it happens with, leaders, executive leaders, and with managers, especially
Mm-hmm.
who have,
Mm-hmm.
the greater responsibility for creating the psychological safety in their teams and their departments and their organizations. And they often just don't know how to do it. Like, they might know it sounds good, they might know it feels important, and might know they want to do it, but often don't really know how when it comes down to the details, to the actual words, to the actual behaviors, like, oh, I know I'm supposed to have one-on-one meetings with my direct reports, so I do that, but I don't even know the questions I could ask that would
Yeah.
build more psychological safety between
Mm-hmm.
us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like, hey, so what does a good working relationship between us look like to you? What's something I can do more of to support you and your work? What have you been wanting to do more of here? Like, what's something I'm doing that's detracting from our work
Mm-hmm.
together? Just being able to ask those questions and have people really share with you is that can create the psychological safety, but people just don't know the fine details on how to do it. And so
Wow.
sometimes it's little exercises we do. There's this exercise, I think inspired by Brene Brown, where you think of trust and safety is like a glass jar that has marbles in it. Somebody
Mhm.
does something that builds trust with you. It kind of adds a marble to
Mhm.
our jar. Something that does something that takes away trust. It's like taking out a marble. Sometimes someone does something that breaks the whole jar
Yeah.
and it's never going to hold marbles, right?
Mhm.
Unless we do
Mhm.
some serious super glue repair.
That's right. That's right.
Right. But
That's right.
that's a good metaphor to think about those things that actually build trust with you and how different people can do that or how you can do that with them. To also think about bias and exclusion. Who shows up at work and like your jar is already full because there's something about them that you just trust one another, and who shows
Mhm.
up with a jar that's empty and it seems like there's a hole in the bottom because you feel like you're putting marbles in and they're just falling
Mhm.
right through, right? So it's a metaphor to talk about all kinds of things. So we can do interactive activities like that and just get people to see what an essential part of inclusion this is.
Wow. What I love about that and your approach toward that is it requires intention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sometimes leaders think that safety and inclusion, like those kinds of realities, are organic, right?
Mm-hmm.
My colleague Annie McKay talks about people playing get to know you bingo and that creating the safety when that's an activity you might feel great about each other, but then you go back to work and it's the same sort of set of challenges and feeling unsafe. So I love the intentionality around that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
People think it can be also enough to be like inclusive in your own head. Like, I don't judge anybody, I
Oh.
respect everyone, so I'm good. When
Yeah.
in fact, it's not that simple. It's not
Nor is it that
straightforward, right?
good.
Inclusion is about how the other person feels. And so we got to do things actively to make it so people feel that. As my colleague Gloria Cotton often says, we all know how to be inclusive, and we are all very inclusive of the people that we're inclusive of.
That's right.
But are we
That's
doing
right.
that for everyone equally to the same
That's
degree?
right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So this season of the podcast is about leadership. So
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you, what are both the challenges and the opportunities that you see, in fact, from your vantage point in your work for organizational leaders or DEI leaders?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the challenges and the opportunities in the work that you're seeing and what you do every day?
Yeah, that's a great question, and so much of the focus of our work these days. I mean, there are a lot of challenges, right? Some of the
Mhm.
challenges are just unlearning some of the things that
Yes.
got them to where they are. They've like proven to be successful, so they're a little ingrained, right? Things like, having all the answers or acting like you have all the answers. That might have gotten you pretty far. And now, especially these days, in this climate, in this DEI climate, that is not the right approach, right?
Yeah.
More humble, more authentic, more vulnerable, and admitting when you don't have all the answers, admitting when you have things to learn. That is going to be more effective now. But you've got to unlearn a lot of habits and mindsets. If the leaders are cisgender straight white men, which unfortunately still too many are, there's a lot of socialization they need to unlearn too,
Mhm.
to even being able to take feedback or not
Yes.
center certain ways of being, or so those are some additional challenges that we've got to work with. The way people are so busy these days, getting enough time to really
Yes.
work with them to do this
Yes.
work is a
Yes.
big challenge, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Especially your work, because your work is not like you can do a 60-minute workshop, right? Or
mhm,
90-minute or 2 hours or half day, how much
mhm,
ever time. But
mhm.
you gotta our clients have to spend that time
Yeah.
practicing, putting so that time piece is important.
It's very important. And the good news is there's so many opportunities. Like there's so much progress they can actually make, which
Yes.
is amazing. I mean, like being able to work with them to really see what a true culture of inclusion could be and how to get there, right?
Yes.
Being able to work with them to see the importance of equity, right? Thinking about your work and how we need to be intentional, not just in our individual interactions, but in our systems, in our policies, in our procedures, in our practices. And we need to be intentional to find where the inequity and the bias is coming through in those structures and to root that out and do things differently. Like, that's essential, but we can do it. And so the opportunities are there if we can get the time. And it takes different paths, right? Like, some leaders understand the importance and they are ready to start the journey. Some are not, but if they've got a budget for a speaker and you can do a talk that gets them interested in it, gets them seeing in a new way, then we can maybe engage in that conversation in a new way. So we don't approach every organization from the same, on-ramp, like you said. I love that language. But there's so many ways to actually make progress.
Yes, I love that. And I love the optimism of that because I believe any organization can make the change.
Yeah.
If they're willing and have courage. I don't believe there's a unique secret to it. I believe that anybody, any organization that wants to shift their practice can.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're wrapping up, I want to ask one question that I ask all the guests, which is, if you had space to give one piece of advice to your clients to move them forward in their journey, what would it be?
I love this question. I think my one piece would be, don't underestimate what there is that you don't know or that you haven't really internalized. And I think that might be too many double negatives. Was that too many double negatives? In other words, you and other people don't know as much as you think you do about these topics. I mean, do people know that there's been racism in the past? Yes, right? Have they heard words like structural racism? Yes. Can they repeat those? And maybe in a way that sounds like they even believe it? Maybe. But do they really know the extent of how structures continue to reinforce inequity? Not structures from the past, structures from today, right?
Yes.
I don't think so. Do they really understand the pervasiveness of the exclusion that happens subtly and how that impacts people? No, I don't think so. When an SAE has happened, and when it's happened just so often, and when it's happened so often that you even anticipate it happening when it doesn't actually happen, and how that impacts people. Do you understand how there's still subtle ways we're impacting young children today so that they're going to grow up with the same biases and understanding in a way that's going to impact the future? No, I think there's so much deeper understanding that people still need when it comes to these topics. And they might feel some fatigue, like, haven't we been talking about this for long enough? And I would say we've barely just begun to really talk about it.
Oh, wow. I appreciate that so much. So if people want to connect with you and connect with your work, where can they find you?
The best hub is probably on our website, which is www.irisinclusion.com.
Oh, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Michael, and giving us the gift of your experience and your insight. I appreciate that so much and look forward to connecting with you next time. That's this week's episode of Race in the Workplace. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and share it with a friend who may be a DEI professional who can use these strategies in their work. My hope for the podcast is that it reaches every person who needs it. Until next time, take care.